Satan, interviewing. You know that's what they doing. Stick around. It's about to get all Ruby up in here. Remote Ruby starts now.
If it feels like deja vu, it probably is. Because it feels like we were just talking with Marty Haught, and he's back with us today. Stands Andrew and the other Rocky Mountain Ruby crew. But Marty, hello, and thanks for coming back.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here again. It was just a few weeks ago. I'm like, wow.
In the last episode we recorded, I was telling a story about how my son was trying to troll me. And so he was like, Siri, play Remote Ruby podcast. There she goes. And sure enough, like it was that episode. So it just like went into the whole Rocky Mountain Ruby episode recently. So right. I'm engulfed in just Marty everywhere right now.
Wow. Okay. Nice.
But today let's talk Ruby Central. And I don't think Ruby Central should be foreign to anyone listening, but Ruby Central, nonprofit behind keeping Bundler and RubyGems up and running, the unspoken hero, and also historically is put on Rails and RubyConf. And you've been a part of Ruby Central in various ways for a while. So before we get into what you're doing now, when did you first join Ruby Central?
I joined in 2012 as a board member and conference organizer. So I helped with RubyConf 2012 in Denver. They were like, we're in Denver and Marty's there, and Marty's a conference organizer. So it would be great to have some help, someone local. And so that was the time when the original founders of Ruby Central were stepping down. So David Black was the final of the original three to step down, and I took David's seat in 2012. But Evan Phoenix and Ben Schofield took the other two the previous year from Rich Kilmer and Chad Fowler. So it was this changing of the guard for Ruby Central at that point. So yeah, I was number 3, and there was just conferences from then on.
So was that kind of your primary role?
It was. So back then, Ruby Central was pretty chill about its conferences. It's important to note that RailsConf was its own thing. So 2006, Ruby Central put on RailsConf the first year. And it was just kind of like a RubyConf, but larger and with a Rails focus. But 2007 on to 2011, O'Reilly ran Rails Conference and changed it to be the conference that everyone grew to expect. Very polished. I wouldn't say corporate, but just a different level of conference from what RubyConf had been, which was just like, this is a conference for developers. We're not going to do a ton of extra effort. I mean, I think it was New Orleans 2011, where like no one from Ruby Central showed up at the registration table. And like, if someone is like 8:00, like, is someone going to come down and like give people badges and stuff? And like Evan runs down. So like, understand that back then, we just wanted to get together and hack. It wasn't a well-run production that way. I mean, it was a great experience, right? So when I joined, I had been running Rocky Mountain Ruby, as we talked about previously, and was very interested in how you run a well-oiled conference machine. And I had to, because I was the sole organizer. It would be overwhelming if I didn't have systems in place to make that possible. So when I came to Ruby Central, I'm like, okay, here are the things I learned the hard way running my own conference. Let's bring some of that to RubyConf. RailsConf we already had a pattern for that. And we were also hiring folks at Ruby Central. So it wasn't Evan and myself or Ben doing everything. So like we got better at that. But I did focus primarily on how do we run conferences well. And that was my focus. Evan was the one who oversaw RubyGems. We could talk a little bit about RubyGems, sort of its history and bundler and all that, because that's very top of mind for me with my new role. But we can continue with the conference stuff too, if we want to keep going there.
Yeah. I have a couple more questions to conference, and then we'd love to talk RubyGems. Yeah. So I forgot, I had heard O'Reilly did RailsConf for a while. You said 2011 was the last O'Reilly year?
Yeah.
So you got involved right as RailsConf then changed hands into Ruby Central.
Yeah, that's right. Though I joined after RailsConf 2012. Okay. I think RailsConf 2012 was the conference where it was a pot pie for lunch every day. Like, oh, a chicken pot pie. Or, oh, we have a pot pie for lunch today.
Should bring that back.
Again, I wasn't there, so I didn't get to experience the pot pie extravaganza, but it was a thing I heard. And I think the other thing that made RailsConf really helped run it was Leah Silber, who with Tildy, she ran a Golden Gate Ruby conference for many years. And she stayed on to help run the sponsorship program, which is really important because sponsorships are a key piece of running a conference and making sure you don't lose money. And of course, you have to take care of sponsors like the expo hall. There's a ton of work that goes into managing sponsors, managing that space, so much logistics into that. And so Leah did that for us. And that made things dramatically easier to where the Ruby Central folks could focus purely on program. And I think an important thing that we developed around then was the idea of the program committee. Because before then, just the chair, the organizer, was in charge of the entire program. And it was just a lot of work. And I think Ben, unfortunately, burned himself out trying to run RailsConf just about solo from a program standpoint. So I saw this and I'm like, we have to make it sustainable by bringing more people in. Plus, the program committee is great because then you have different folks in the community sharing their perspective and picking talks and putting tracks together. And so they can kind of bring their own personal touch to a part of the conference. And so that for me was like, one, this is going to make my life and our lives easier, but it's also just better for the conference to have different people have their fingerprints all over the event.
Yeah, my first RailsConf was 2015. I saw so many moving parts the second I walked up even to the registration booth. So can't imagine starting from the ground up and it turning into that. I'm sure there's just, for example, the pot pie event sounds like, I'm glad they had that even, right? That's awesome. How involved were you in conferences with Ruby Central and for how long?
From 2012 on, I was heavily involved with most of the conferences. I did take time off because it's intense because we had 3 directors. At that point, Ben had stepped off. I want to say in 2014 is I think when Ben stepped away and Sarah May joined in his place. And so Sarah, Evan, and myself essentially rotated through who was the primary chair so that we didn't have to run 2 conferences in a row fully. So you kind of get a little bit of time off. I mean, not exactly, because you're still involved. You still MC, you still show up, but maybe you're not like the point person making sure everything's happening. And the program committee made that easier. But I stayed involved. I think 22 is when I really fully stepped back. I did nothing in 23. And part of that is also like, if I keep doing all this, then I remain in place and they're dependent on me. I think from 2017 on, I was thinking about how do I have others kind of own this and drive it forward? And I empower them, support them, but don't do all the work. And so we started having co-chairs. So we had 2 chairs. I don't remember which year that was, maybe 2018, maybe 2019. We expanded the board in 2019 to include folks that had been on the program committee. And so the secret about the program committee was also Marty's board test ground. Are these people suitable? Can they run a conference? And would we think they would be good board members in the future that could run the organization? And so like the folks that were added to the board had all been on the program committee and done well, clearly engaged, cared about the conference, agreed on the right things. And also people are different. So like, I love it that like Allison might want to do something slightly different with the event or Chelsea or whoever. They all brought their own flavor and that was perfect.
That's great. I feel like I'm going to do this several times, so bear with me. So we got to 2022. Let's jump back. You mentioned you joined the board in 2012.
Yeah.
What does being on the board at Ruby Central entail? What does that look like?
Well, it depends on when you're talking about. Back in 2012, we really didn't behave like a true nonprofit. There was a bunch of things you do as a nonprofit that we weren't really doing. So it was a very small organization. There wasn't a ton of work to be done. Abby Phoenix, Evan's wife, ran the organization essentially from 2012 on. So like when I joined, she had joined just before that. And so she was learning how to basically operate the organization and the events. And we eventually expanded to have additional folks help out. Shirley Bales helped us a lot. She had been working with O'Reilly, so she came over and helped us part-time with speaker management, sponsor management for RubyConf, and just other things around the conference. And then we hired Heather Johnson in 2015. She actually lives in Atlanta and helped with the Atlanta RailsConf. And we got along so that when we wanted to hire some full-time, Heather applied and we hired her. So as a board member, what we had to do was sort of like make high-level decisions about the events, the organization, what to do with the money. The events made money back then, and we had a surplus, and we're a nonprofit. So it's like we would do grants, we would support like the Ruby Association, we would help organizers here and there. We had an organizers program where we help new organizers kind of support them, get them going. But most of it was focused on the conferences. RubyGems was part of the picture. Evan was involved and oversaw that. He personally built a bunch of the infrastructure around RubyGems and the transition from the early days of RubyGems, which would have been back in 2003, to kind of like the evolution over time. But as a board member, we met monthly. We had to file a 990. That's part of like the contract with the IRS. And as a nonprofit, you report, what do you do with money? And so we did 990s every year. We had accountants that worked with us. But primarily it was making decisions around like program or policies, like adopting a code of conduct. That was something we adopted pretty early on. I want to say 2013 was when we adopted the code of conduct. And that was pretty early. Like back then it was being discussed, but a lot of conferences didn't have them. And we would discuss as a board, the three of us, Sarah May, do we want to put in a code of conduct? What does that look like? How do we adopt it? Do we get training? So if you have a code of conduct, then you have to be able to enforce it, right? Like, so if something happens at an event, how do you do that? So we had to do training to train ourselves and our volunteers to deal with code of conduct incident. And we had some. We definitely had those come up, and you have to like, okay, what do we do in this moment? And sometimes they were a bit tricky. Some of them were cut and dry, but that was part of the job.
That is a job I do not envy, but am grateful that someone does, because it makes it a lot easier for the rest of us.
Yeah.
You mentioned RubyGems. 2003 is as far back as you kind of mentioned. So I got started in Rails, Ruby 2012. I was just like slinging PHP before that. So the idea of like even like these, versions, packages that I can just pull down was new. Yeah, I don't really know the history of RubyGems. And so I'd be interested to hear about not only, what you know about the history of RubyGems, but how it then became part of Ruby Central's stewardship.
I'll tell the story as best I can. I wasn't close to it in the beginning. My understanding was that at RubyConf 2003, they just hacked together RubyGems. I think Jim Wyrick, Chad Fowler, Rich Kilmer, I think. I'm sure there's some others, not really sure who else was involved, but they just built it, in the evenings or at RubyConf. And I think it went live 2004. I'm not sure exactly when it went live. It was hosted, I think Tom Copeland, who was a part of that group, hosted it on a server in his closet, as one did back then. I mean, like 2003, there's no cloud. It's like, okay, spin up a Linux machine, on my old 486 or something and put it in a closet, connect to the internet. There you go. I think it's important to note that when RubyGems came out, there wasn't really a providing archives, code bundles was a new thing. I mean, I guess it had been around, but like there was a thing called I think it was the Ruby Archive, RIA. I don't remember exactly, but that was a potential rival to RubyGems. And they're kind of like, look, we should have an easy way to distribute code. Because I think back in the day, you would just like find a link to it, you pull it down, and you would install it yourself. And so it was all very manual. And so RubyGems was like, look, you can run this command, RubyGems, and you could, gem install whatever. And like that would be easy for everyone. And so that was brand new back then. And so that's how it started. And I think it was just hacked on by the group for a while. And then at some point, I don't know what year, maybe 2008, there was this awareness that dependency management was becoming a problem. And you had multiple versions of Ruby. So the thing was, there was Ruby 1.8 and there was Ruby 1.9 that came out. And all of a sudden, you couldn't just say you have one version of Ruby. And so RVM came about because like you need to be able to manage all your Ruby versions. This app might use that version of Ruby and that one might use a different version of Ruby. And so all of a sudden now you had this complexity around, well, wait, which version of Ruby and which gems are installed? And oh crap, this one depends on that. And so this all came about during that time. And again, I wasn't close to that work, but Bundler became a thing. Engine Yard was heavily involved. They had, Yehuda Katz and Andre Arco were both there and they built these things. And that slowly got merged into work more closely with RubyGems and made things dramatically better. So the rise of the Ruby version managers and Bundler and RubyGems together made that story dramatically better for devs.
I heard Yehuda Katz was involved with Bundler when I first started working with Yarn. It was like, oh yeah, it makes total sense that Yehuda would work with Yarn because he has this history of this.
Yeah.
That's cool. And what does it look like today with Ruby Central in terms of RubyGems and different things like that?
We'll walk back a little more in time because there's some interesting sort of points there. I think it was maybe 2011 or 2012 that companies started to shift their focus. First of all, Node had become popular. And so there's a lot of energy going towards that ecosystem. And so you started to see people drift away from Ruby as the big hot thing to like, especially in the JavaScript realm, exploring those spaces. And so we started to see less support from companies. And so Yehuda Katz moved on to work on Ember and eventually Rust, I believe. And so he was no longer primarily working on Bundler and all that. And Andre Arco took over that. And at some point, Engine Yard, who had been employing Andre, was no longer able to do that. At some point, I don't remember if that's 2013, 2014, somewhere in that time frame, all of a sudden, the people that had been fully employed to build this and support it were no longer employed to do that. And so Ruby Together came about around then. Andre put that together because Andre recognized that Bundler was incredibly important to the ecosystem and needed maintenance and upkeep. And there's still things to build in it. And there was no longer any support for that. So Ruby Together came about for that purpose. And for many years, raised money. They had a membership program. But I don't know if they ever really got a huge amount of success. It was enough. That team was very scrappy. They had to go for times where they didn't have a lot of funding and they might have to pause work, or people are spending nights and weekends only to work on some of these things. But they made it work. And all this time, RubyGems was still hosted by Ruby Central, has always been hosted by Ruby Central. We paid the hosting bills. It moved over to AWS at some point in time from Tom's closet server. And we just paid for it. We never really talked a lot about that. We made money from conferences. So the hosting bill, which I think at times was $150,000 a year, was being subsidized by Ruby Central for years.
Whoa.
Yeah, I mean, there's times where like the bill was $11,000 in a month or $12,000 in a month. I think we're now about $8,000 a month is what it costs to run the infrastructure. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those pieces, but that was the way it was. And we never thought like, hey, we should maybe talk about this with the community. Maybe we should look for a funding model for this. We're just like, it's working. We make money. We're a nonprofit. What else are we going to do with this? RubyGems, that's the service we provide from the beginning. People depend on it. It's very important. So anyway, that was kind of, this is really the teen years were that. Well, by 2019, things are tough for Ruby Together. And Andre approached me about like, Ruby Central owns basically half of the equation of RubyGems, the hosting service aspect. And we're doing all the maintenance and upkeep. Maybe we should combine together. We're aligned on the same purposes here. I'm like, that sounds great. And so we started that discussion. And it took 3 years. The pandemic may have had a little bit to do with slow down to that process, but we did. And in 2022, Ruby Together fully merged with Ruby Central, and Ruby Central now took over both sides. So the maintenance upkeep of the service as well as just running the infrastructure. So that's kind of how it came to be fully in Ruby Central's domain. Ruby Central had a lot of challenges around now because the pandemic shifted, conferences became very difficult. We started losing money on conferences. So all that surplus we had built up started to dwindle. And we're trying to figure out how to support all these things. Also, we were growing up as an organization. So, I mentioned in the beginning, we weren't a true nonprofit. We didn't do certain things that nonprofits do, like say fundraising, annual reports. There's a whole bunch of things that nonprofits do because they have to. But we didn't have to in the beginning because we had a constant revenue stream through the conferences. So it was fine. And we're volunteers. Like, we're not looking for more work. And we also kept things very, very lean. So we didn't want to just hire a bunch of people and have a large staff. And so we found ourselves realizing, one, we needed to change. And then we had a lot of adversity around the pandemic and conferences struggling that really focused us on getting good at becoming a nonprofit. So we're still in that process of adopting that. So fundraising is a big focus in the last year. And you can see the difference in communication in the last 18 months compared to the previous 10 years.
Yo, quick question for you. Do you want higher clarity into production but don't have the time to become a wizard in observability? Honeybadger Insights is exactly what you need. Forget the old school trio of logs, metrics, and traces. We're talking structured events that don't just sit there. They're your treasure map to solving mysteries in your app. With Honeybadger, sling your logs and events into the mix and voila, you just unlock the power of Honeybadger's new query language, BadgerQL. It's like having a conversation with your data. Ask it anything. Turn mishaps into metrics and showcase your wins on dashboards that even the marketing team will drool over. And guess what? This isn't just for big spenders. Honeybadger's got you covered with a free plan that packs a punch, including error tracking, uptime monitoring, sleek status pages, and more. Oh, and speaking of errors, Honeybadger treats them like VIPs at the club. With Insights and BadgerQL, your errors aren't just problems, they're opportunities. Explore your data in ways you didn't think were possible and get the insights that you deserve. Check out honeybadger.io. That's right, honeybadger.io.
I remember Ruby Central as like Sarah, Evan, you. I didn't see like a figurehead. If I did, it was Abby Phoenix because she was just really good at everything she did.
Yeah.
But now, like I think in the last couple of years, there's been like someone like a director. Like, is that the right perception now?
Yeah. And I think Abby wasn't officially an executive director. So Abby was very much operations, but she was not the person that's running the organization that way. So wasn't an ED in that fashion. She just was basically an operations person. And it was great. So Evan or myself or Sarah really played that role, but the three of us really didn't want that either. So it's kind of like, as needed, we would step into that role and do whatever's needed. Now, we recognized as part of expanding the board that we needed to have an executive director because there's a whole bunch of things around the nonprofit that we weren't doing that we should have been doing. And so we hired two different executive directors. We hired Jenny Chang, and she had never been an executive director fully, so that wasn't a great fit. And then we hired Neil after that, and again, wasn't a great fit. So we kind of had two mishires essentially that weren't right. And also, we just didn't know what we needed exactly. It's just hard to know. You're hiring someone who either has experience with nonprofits, but doesn't know the Ruby community, doesn't know how to run our organization. And so like, what are we optimizing for when we hire someone that we thought we knew, but like we didn't realize what we really needed? And so Adarsh stepped up from the board and became the executive director. And I think you've seen Adarsh out there doing tons of things and being more of that true figurehead type as you expect.
Yeah, he's visible, he's accessible. He was on the board before, right? Before he became...
He was. And he came from Ruby Together. So when Ruby Together merged with Ruby Central, Adarsh joined the board from that merge. That's where he had been plugged in previously.
That's great. Okay. You can see the shift in it from the outside. And it's nice to hear the backstory and see how it has become what it has become. I am curious. It was recently announced that you're back involved is not the right
Yeah.
word, maybe, but you have
Yeah.
a new role. What does that look like?
For the listeners out there, I stepped off the board, resigned from the board in December of 2023, so last year. And I was a director of engineering at Haught at the time, and I got laid off in February with a lot of other people. And so all of a sudden, now I have a bunch of free time on my hands. I've got like, what do I want to do next? So let me step back real quick here. So one of the last things I did with Ruby Central was started the open source committee, because we had Ruby together now. We now had this obligation to run the service. And so the traditional model in a nonprofit is you have a committee that focuses on one program or domain of the organization and runs that. And the board has so much to do. They're really quite busy. They need to delegate more. And so I wanted to get an open source committee running before I departed, because otherwise I felt like we were at risk of like not doing well with the open source program. So also understand that Andre had been running this for so long, and Andre was ready for a break, maybe less intense engagement, maybe fully step away, maybe just like step away to be like kind of like part-time or whatever. So in our minds, we're like, okay, we need to find the succession plan of how we, one, create an open source committee that oversees this work, but also how do we make it sustainable going forward? And so I set that in motion last summer, and Afuk and Mike Galasio and Gabby Stefiani, Andre Arco, and Martin MD joined the committee to see that forward with myself. So that was the start of it. So when I stepped away completely, I stayed involved with the committee. And as I got more free time, I started just volunteering and helping out the team with advising them on things. It's, I guess, an important thing to also note is that when Ruby Together merged with Ruby Central, all of a sudden there was more interest in funding our efforts. So the first was Shopify with their Ruby Shield program. And that was a 4-year, $1 million contribution over 4 years that started in summer of 22. And so like that became a reality because of this merge. And so all of a sudden now we had interest from certain companies to help improve security and resiliency around RubyGems, because it was running on a shoestring and nights and weekends type maintenance work. And that's maybe not great for a mission critical service. So there was already that desire. So the committee was to oversee this, make sure we're doing well, and also allow Andre to step back. And how do you create a team or a program that runs this? So I'm advising them this spring on that. And it became clear we raised even more money. I mean, like I think in the 23 to 24, so like July 23 to June of this 24, we had $970,000 that went towards open source, that we built a lot of things. And we can talk a little bit about what we built. But it just became clear that this was becoming a full-time job, or at least part-time job that needed dedicated focus. And so that's where the role came from, is this desire to have someone who can handle all the different aspects of the job, which we can talk about shortly. And that was something the board realized, and they created that role in August.
What's the official title of the role?
I am the interim open source lead. You can think of it as sort of like a fractional VP of engineering type role. So what it entails is there's one, the operations of the RubyGems service. There is the tracking, the maintenance and upkeep of that, and overseeing all the folks working on behalf of Ruby Central on RubyGems and Bundler. And there's a few other things like Ruby API, Ruby Toolbox, there's a few other of these services that we use that we've kind of pulled in as part of this broader ecosystem of the gems Ruby ecosystem, I guess you could call. So there's sort of like an engineering management piece here. There's a program management in terms of like, what are we trying to do? How do we communicate our progress with stakeholders? And there's also a fundraising aspect now, because if you think about it, we've had a lot of extra funding come in, but they're one-time programs. They're like AWS last year sponsored Samuel Giddens to be a full-time security engineer, which has been amazing. Alpha Omega, which is a foundation supported by the big cloud providers. So Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, you talk about the organization's work, the security audits. So they've funded those programs and are going to fund Samuel's second year with us. But these are all like one-time programs that have been funded. The Sovereign Tech Fund was the other one that was major. A lot of money came from them to improve security and resiliency around open source. So this is a big deal, but these are one-time things. They'll go away. And so like, do we go back to the shoestring budget? How do we build a recurring revenue model that can keep these things going? This is all part of the job. And so in many ways, it's kind of like a startup CTO in a way. Like you're trying to like build this thing. Oh, there's a lots of legacy things to pay off because this is, like maybe we should do these infrastructure upgrades with a security audit. We're aware of like, this is maybe not the best like access model for users. Like if someone were to hack and take over Samuel's account, they could do great harm. So like, let's think about risk around that. So there's a whole bunch of things that we're aware we need to do, but we also need to have funding to be able to do all that work.
So as part of your role, I guess, thinking about how do we generate the next group of income to help this keep going?
Yeah. And like, why would you? Is RubyGems important enough to the community? Should companies support it in some way? What does that model look like? Is it important that RubyGems is run by an independent nonprofit? What if a corporation, like the NPM story, like what if a corporation took over and ran that? Is that what we want? Or do we value that a nonprofit that's focused on the health and thriving of the community and the ecosystem is the one, driving that?
Does GitHub own NPM now?
Yeah, they do.
They seem to be good stewards of it, at least,
right,
which is good. But you might not get that lucky. And these are things that like every day, I don't know how many times they run bundle install for various projects and don't even think about it that much. And it's a lot of bandwidth, I'm sure, that I've used personally. A lot of bandwidth GitHub CI is used and things that we generally as a community take for granted. But it's important to have that conversation so that, yes, we can decide where it goes as a community as opposed to, well, we didn't pay attention enough and now like someone else has to own it and run it as part of their business or whatever. I would prefer it's run by the community and everything. Like where it came from, it has made our lives so much easier. Bundler's the one that's being copied. Yarn is inspired by all the better decisions of like version. There's a lot of details that go into like properly resolving versions and all that like NPM originally wasn't great at. Yarn came out to improve that. Then NPM's gotten better, but like Bundler set the bar very high. And I think just being part of the community after Bundler existed, I didn't really get to experience much of it beforehand. I remember I had a couple Rails projects that were config.gem or something in the application RB file. And I was very confused on what to do then because we needed not the latest version of some package, but one version before that. And it took me forever to figure that out. And it's like having Bundler just made our lives way easier. The nonprofit in a way has to think a bit like a business because there is never ending need for continuing to fund the maintenance and making sure you offer a way for people to be able to contribute, but get something back in return. I've used RubyGems for 11, 12 years or whatever for free. Never thought about that for the longest time about who pays for all this bandwidth or anything. And I bet you most Ruby developers are in the same boat. And I think it's really important that we're talking about this and figuring out, how do we make this more sustainable? You can depend on Shopify's and GitHub's to do huge contributions, but it's also like very dependent on them. And if they stop, then you've got a giant hole to fill. And if we can contribute as individuals some, and then small business can contribute as well or whatever, it helps spread that balance out, which is kind of the same thing as like you got a company with massive enterprise contracts or something, or many, many like smaller business customers like Basecamp talks about. They don't have any massive enterprise contracts. So if they lose a customer, it doesn't affect them. And that's a pretty tough problem in nonprofits. It's very helpful for me for you to talk about this stuff because I've been on the sidelines too much. I depend on this, all the work you guys are doing. And I didn't even really know who half of you were for so long. And it's helpful to meet you at conferences and whatever else. And then like, oh, like I finally got to meet Andre at RailsConf. But it was like, man, I feel like we could have been really good friends for so many years. We just hadn't connected yet. So anyways, I saw that you guys are looking for, Ruby Central posted yesterday that you guys are looking for new board members.
Yes.
It sounded like ideally people who have done fundraising before or writing grants or whatever. Like if I was interested, I've never done any of that before. How much experience do you ideally have?
Yeah, I'm not on the board anymore, so I'm not part of that process. But the way we thought about it in the past is we are a working board. And so every member has something they can contribute. And so oftentimes they'll sort of like drop a list of areas that they feel aren't represented well or they could use more help with. And so that drives a lot of the motivation to bring certain people on. Ideally, somebody knows a lot about nonprofits, but not everyone has to know about that. Like you could just be an expert at this one area and that is valuable. So I think if you or any other listeners out there feel like they've got a skill set that can help Ruby Central as a board member, then they definitely apply and tell your story in the form that they ask you to fill out. Why should you be the board member? Like, what would you do? How would you help Ruby Central move forward?
Awesome. We need to wrap, but I have one question. I've always wanted to ask you.
This is how we know it's going to be good.
Oh,
For
wow.
so long, I've gone to like RailsConf, RubyConf, and I'll be like, yo, you got plans tonight? And they're like, we're going to the Marty dinner.
Oh, yes.
I have a vague understanding, but I have to hear about this infamous dinner.
No, I'm happy to talk about it. It's fascinating. So the origin of the Marty dinner, or like what propelled me to do this, is when I went to the Scottish Ruby Conference, I think in 2011, Paul Campbell invited me last minute, like, hey, Marty, do you want to go to dinner tonight? We got like this spot. And I'm like, sure. And Jeremy Heingartner, a friend of mine, was already going. So I think we were actually together. And so I got brought to this dinner. There was 8 of us. It was in a private room at this restaurant called 21212 in Edinburgh. And it was mind-blowing. It was like, what are we eating? It was amazing conversation. There was lots of wine brought out, and it was just really a good experience. It was like maybe 3 hours. I'm not sure how long it was. So I was like, wow, this is great. And I have always loved food and recognized about this time that I actually was sort of a foodie. I didn't really think of myself that way. So I started to seek out these interesting restaurants to essentially recreate that experience. And so, of course, conferences are a fantastic place where all these cool people are together. And hey, do you all want to go to some fancy, interesting restaurant and spend a lot of money and have your mind blown? And so that was the start of it. So 2013, I think, was the first year I ran that in Portland. And it was just like, who do I know that is willing to spend a lot of money on food? Because a lot of people aren't. If I told you how much we spent on dinner, you'd be like, oh, yeah, no, I don't like dinner that much. But I've been running it ever since 2013, pretty much, when I go to conferences, and I know enough people. And so we've had some insane places we've gone to. We went to Alinea in Chicago back in 2014. Alinea is like a top 50 world best restaurant. You're like, what am I even eating? This is like art. Is this food? Oh, okay, I can eat this. You just look up Alinea in Chicago and just look up. You can see pictures of what you eat. There's a place called Kai outside of Phoenix. So that was RailsConf.
2017, yeah.
And I think there was literally dirt in one of the dishes. And so they usually like 10 course, 11 course type things with paired wines or cocktails. And it's usually like you're eating art or something. I mean, like, it is really good. There's a sort of usual suspects that are willing to spend this much money and they go to the Marty dinner, and I can't actually invite that many people, so I don't broadcast it. But that is a little bit more on the Marty dinner.
That's the context I've been so curious about for so long. I love that. I think it's so cool you do that. The people who go, they all seem to love it. So I think it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's been lots of interesting people that have joined. Oftentimes we'll invite keynoters, like Sandy Metz came to many of them and she swore by them. It's just like, yes, amazing conversation. It's all over the place. And, you get 12 interesting people together and you spend 3 hours in a meal with them. Yeah, totally.
That's so cool. Well, Marty, I am grateful that you joined us today. I am grateful for not only your historic, but your current involvement in the Ruby community. And if there is any way any of us can ever repay the favor in any way, please let us know.
Well, I will say that I will be speaking at RubyConf. Samuel Giddens and I will be speaking about the state of RubyGems. And I'll expand a little bit on what I touched on today in a conference presentation. So I would say tune into that, watch the video when it comes out. If you can't come to RubyConf, watch the talk and then how do you support us? What does that look like? What are the best ways? And one of the things I'm thinking about is how do I make an on-ramp for newer engineers, devs to contribute to open source, to get part of this? What does an open source program engagement look like? And I'm going to talk about that. So I would say tune into that. And if that resonates, then I'd love to see how you can help.
That is great. I'm looking forward to that. And going to the conference is a great way to support Ruby Central. If it looks like tickets are expensive, it's because you're getting the conference and you're helping Ruby Central. Like you were saying, historically, the way that you guys brought in the most money to support, and that's been very hard because of the pandemic and just things in general over the last few years, inflation, yada, yada, lots of wrenches being thrown at you. And this is a great way for us to support and stuff. And I think Drew Bragg was talking about it, saying, don't think of it as buying just a ticket to a conference. It is supporting Ruby Central, and you happen to get a conference with it, which
it's a great experience. You can network, you can talk to cool people. There's so much you can get out of it, but it is about supporting. And if people don't come, well, that's not good for Ruby Central. Ooh, dark days are ahead if people don't support the conference. Yeah.
Well, Marty, we appreciate it and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you guys. It's been great.
Yeah, we'll see you in November.
Yes, definitely.